Hello everybody and welcome to the latest edition in the Petri webinar series. Today we are hanging out with my buddy Paul and we're going to be talking about something that I think it touches home with just about everybody. We're going to be talking about Office 365, but specifically the licenses that you might be not using, and Paul's going to be talking about ways to save potentially money. But before we do that, if you guys have any questions throughout the webinar, please don't hesitate to ask. We're going to talk about them at the end. But for now, I'm going to hand it over to Paul to give it a go. Paul, have at it.
Great, thanks, Brad, and welcome everybody. Right now it's a sunny day in Alabama, and there are a bunch of heavy Air Force jets doing touch and goes right over my head, so life is good. As long as the cat doesn't throw up during this webinar and ruin my home office ambiance, we'll all be good. I like talking about licensing, and this is a little bit of a religious change for me because all my years in the industry, I've always hated to talk about Microsoft licensing. It's confusing, it's complicated, and it changes all the time. And people, when you confront them with something they don't understand or that is confusing, they get tense, and it's just, the whole thing's been very unpleasant. But my attitude has started to change a little bit because as we see the continued trend of motion into the cloud, what's become clear is that there's actually some upside to talking about licensing, because what I'm starting to find is that there are more and more people out there that we actually can help identify where they're spending or overspending and help them save money, which is actually kind of cool. Now, full disclosure, I work for a company that makes Office 365 management tools, but this webinar is not focused specifically on what those tools do, right? I'd be happy to talk about the tools until you get bored and start to cry, but that's not why I'm here. What I'm here to do is to help you understand the licensing landscape that we're in now and give you two fairly simple principles for effectively managing your license and reducing the amount of wasted licensing money that you're giving Microsoft. Then I'll give you some practical tips that you can use to apply those two principles in your environment. Then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end, as Brad said. So let's start by focusing broadly on what the licensing landscape looks like. So I'm going to ask each of you to think about your own environments and think about how many seats you have, how many users you have, where they are, what they do, how that usage may have changed since the onset of COVID-19. I know at Quadratech, we already had maybe 35 to 40% of our workforce working remotely. Now, of course, it's 100%. That didn't really have a licensing impact for us, but what we found with our customers is that the bigger the customer is, the bigger the impact has been. But even relatively small customers with only a couple thousand seats have seen a lot of unexpected impacts in their own individual organizational licensing landscapes. So I like to think of this landscape as really, having three components to it. The first is your workforce. These are the people that do whatever it is your business does. Okay, and it's going to vary if you're a university versus if you're a government agency versus if you're an airline versus if you're a manufacturing company versus if you're a restaurant chain. The roles and the number of roles and the responsibilities of those roles are going to vary a little bit, but there are some things that are common to pretty much every organization. You're going to have some number of people who are primarily knowledge or information workers. Their job is taking information from somewhere and doing something to it and then providing that information to somebody else. Okay, Microsoft likes the term knowledge worker, but if you have another term, maybe analyst, processor, a lot of different ways you can think about that. There are roles for various kinds of administration, so finance, operations, enterprise resource management, and so on. The point is these roles are different. So the services that someone who is a knowledge worker sitting behind her desk, buying and selling widgets all day, her needs are going to be different from the role of someone who answers the phones in a call center, and his role and the associated needs will be different from someone who drives a truck going to power plants to service gas turbines, for example. So understanding your workforce, what roles there are, where those roles are located in the organization, and the specifics of what they do is the first part of understanding your landscape. The second piece is the workplace. And the way that I usually like to talk about this is to think in terms of the workloads that people need to have in order to carry out their job role. This is a little bit of a weird usage, right? Because Microsoft calls workloads what the rest of us would call applications. So in their world, Exchange Online is a workload. Well, you know what? When you talk to an end user, they don't call it Exchange Online, they call it Outlook. right? Same thing with Teams, although, Teams has pretty quickly become one of those things where the service and the client seem to be one and the same to end users, and so on, right? OneDrive is another example. So as you think about your workforce and the roles that exist in it, you can translate to, and I'm sorry, but the cat just stepped on my keyboard in passing. You can translate that to talking about the specific services that people need to be able to fulfill the responsibilities of their role. Then the third part is licensing. And this is a lot of times where the discussion starts to run off the rails a little bit. Because when people think about licensing, which they do as little as possible, they have to understand that there are a lot of different ways to get the same result from Microsoft. So for example, it would be totally legal and totally possible for you to go out and buy a bunch of Active Directory basic licenses and a bunch of Exchange Online Plan 1 or Plan 2 licenses and a bunch of OneDrive licenses and give them to your users. Well, congratulations, you have just reinvented a big portion of the F3 license. And it probably would cost you more money to do it separately. But that's not always the case, because if you buy, and I'll pick on E3 as an example, if you buy E3 licenses for people who don't actually need the desktop applications, it might very well be cheaper for you to buy the individual workloads that they need a la carte. But Microsoft does not make it easy to figure that out. And I don't mean to say that they're doing it, they're trying intentionally to make it hard to figure out. They're certainly not doing anything to make it easier. You can't just go in and check off a few boxes and say, okay, this is what the bundle would cost versus this is what the a la carte options would cost. So mind the gap is something that anybody who's ever been to London will hear, so often it'll practically become something you hear in your sleep. And I included it here as a little bit of an homage to the fact that the tube system in London, where our office is not really running. But there's a big gap between this bottom bar and the top bar. Okay, so the idea here that I want everybody to walk away with is that your goal is to get to an optimized license model where you are buying only the licenses you need and then making sure that you're getting good value out of those licenses. And this is tricky because you know what, sometimes you don't know what you need. But everybody's going to have this blue bar on the bottom, no matter where you fall in between these two. Everybody starts with some set of licenses that they have spent money on. Now, there are a whole bunch of factors that influence how purchasing licenses works in Microsoft land. Some people buy their licenses retail. Some people buy them through a provider. Some people buy them direct from Microsoft. Some people get them as part of a merger or acquisition. Some people get them through an enterprise agreement. Depending on your organization, if you're an IT person, you may directly buy those licenses, or you may have a purchasing or procurement team that has to buy them for you, which means you always run the risk of getting what the procurement person could get a good deal on, which may not be what you want. Okay, I've seen multiple cases where the business had a requirement for E3s and they ended up coming back with E5s because the purchasing people got such a good deal that, how could they resist? Microsoft has a lot of flexibility in pricing and other commercial terms that they can use to try to drive deals the way they want. But that doesn't always mean that the results are going to be exactly what you would expect or what you want in terms of getting what you ask for. So if we move on to talk about the next bar in this chart, it's the licenses that are assigned to actual people. The little gray bar over on the side shows the over-purchasing amount that you might end up being stuck with. Okay, so you start with, say, 10,000 licenses that you bought, and you only have 8,000 employees. Now you have 2,000 over-purchased licenses. Or what's more common, especially right now, you started off and you had 10,000 employees, you bought 10,000 licenses, now you only have 8,000 employees, and you're still stuck with 2,000 additional licenses that are not assigned to anybody. The next bar up from that are licenses that are actually deployed to a user. Now, this is a little bit tricky because what deployed means is going to vary according to the workload. So for example, if I am deploying OneDrive, normally what that means is I've got the sync client installed on users' workstations and they're able to use OneDrive to synchronize files. For Teams, deployed usually means the user is able to log into Teams and do stuff. So if you think purely about email, there's really not much of a gap between assigned and deployed because everybody gets email. But it's very common to have a bunch of licenses that are assigned to people where the workloads have not been deployed yet or have not been deployed at all. Okay, Yammer is probably the best example of this. If you were to go out into the corporate world and count up the number of people who have Yammer licenses available to them, and then count up the number of people who actually have Yammer deployed and are using it, I think you'd see a pretty good sized gap. Then the middle, right, the gap between deployed to user and optimized is really simple. This is adopted by the user. Okay, so let's go back and talk about our hypothetical Yammer example. If I've got 10,000 E3 licenses in my tenant, they include Yammer. And I've assigned those licenses to people, and anybody who wanted to use Yammer could. It's available to them. It's not blocked or turned off or anything, but nobody's using it. That represents licenses that are deployed but have not been adopted. One of the best ways to improve the value that you get out of your Office 365 licenses is to drive up that adoption percentage. Okay, now this is not an easy task, and there are a lot of different ways that you can attempt to do it. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. But you can see I have this kind of ladder where I have some gray boxes showing me, oh my goodness, I bought licenses, I paid money for these things, but I'm not using them, or I'm not getting good value out of them. Part of my goal in this webinar is to give you some strategies to help shrink the size of the gray box by getting more value and more utilization out of these licenses. We sat down and measured about just under 3.5 million mailboxes under management in our North American customers. And what we found is that about 18% of licenses are what we call Slack licenses, or we really call it license Slack, but I have to be very careful about saying Slack in a Microsoft audience because I don't want anybody to be confused and think I'm talking about Teams. But in this case, what we found was out of all these licenses, about 18% were licenses that the organization had paid money for, but didn't have assigned and wasn't using. Now, you're never going to get to zero Slack for the most part, right? If you have a 100-person company and you buy 100 licenses, then you have zero Slack. If one person leaves and you no longer need a license for that user once they've left, now you're at 1% Slack and so on. So to account for normal business operations, what we typically see, in larger organizations that have good controls in place, anywhere from 3 to maybe 7 or 8% Slack. That gives them a little bit of a buffer because normally larger organizations are going to buy on a 3-year cycle with Microsoft. So you don't want to have to go through and true up every quarter or even every year. And the one way to avoid that is you purposefully overbuy a little bit to make your true up easier. So I promised you earlier that I was going to outline 2 very simple principles. And I don't think it gets much simpler than this. The first principle is buy only what you need. Not hard to understand. Don't overbuy, right? You can think of this like going to Costco. When I was living by myself in an apartment in the Bay Area, I loved going to Costco. Costco's awesome. The problem is, as a single guy living in a 700 square foot apartment, there's very few things you can buy at Costco that you can actually store and use before they go bad. Maybe laundry detergent, potato chips, a few other things like that. So buy only what you need. Don't be like Paul going to Costco, buying a bunch of stuff that you can use but don't actually need and don't really have tools to deal with. Okay. The second principle is adopt everything that you buy. Okay. My grandfather was a big believer in the saying at the dinner table, take all you want, but eat all you take. This is basically the same idea. Figure out how many licenses you should have to support the users and the workloads that you need to run. And then make sure that you are driving adoption and getting good value out of the things you actually have bought. So it's really easy for me to give you these 2 principles, right? This is like saying you should love your mom and call her on Mother's Day, and you should eat your vegetables and you should brush your teeth. Very few people are going to disagree with the idea that these principles are good things and that you should follow them. But the devil is in the details. It's a little bit more challenging when you actually have to do it. So let's talk about how you can turn these principles into something actionable that you actually can do. Okay, first, if you're going to buy only what you need, how do you know what you actually need, right? How are you going to be able to tell that? Well, need is really the delta between how many licenses, what kind of licenses I have, and how many I should have. Okay, and this is tricky because you don't know what you have until you measure it. And you don't know what you should have until you figure out what you should have. So this process of figuring out how to buy only what you need starts with a bunch of really boring questions. How many people are in your organization that you support? How many tenants are they in? What do they do? Where are they? Many of these are the same kinds of questions you probably would have asked or someone would have asked when you were first deploying Office 365. But one of the very interesting things about the deployment of a cloud-based SaaS tool like 365 is sometimes those questions get asked once during the early deployment and then people stop asking them. The service has been deployed. We have hybrid set up, we have ADFS, or we have PHS or whatever set up. And so there are no follow-up questions. And the problem with that is if you don't keep asking those questions every so often, then as your environment changes, your company grows or shrinks or expands or contracts, you don't have a current picture of what the environment really looks like. Now, past those boring questions, there's some additional questions that I think are more interesting. They're harder to answer, but the information and data that you get from trying to answer them is going to tell you a lot more than you might expect. One example is, what licenses do I currently have right now in my tenant? Okay, just as an informal sample, I would say maybe 5% of the customers that I've talked to at Ignite or Inspire or various other conferences have been able to accurately tell me to within 5% how many licenses they have in their tenant. And most people will be the first to admit they don't really know. They'll say things like, well, we have about 35,000 licenses, but we only have about 19,000 employees. And I think the rest of those licenses, some of them are for shared mailboxes and they wander off into the weeds. We have some team room systems, but they couldn't tell you if you offered them $1,000 on the spot to tell you precisely how many licenses they have of each category or each SKU. Most people can't do it. And that's not surprising, right? That's not a thing we normally track as IT pros, because as long as you have enough licenses, it doesn't really matter how many you have in a lot of ways. How are my licenses distributed across or between tenants? Now, this is tricky. This is one of those things that are like public folders. People who have multiple tenants are very interested in being able to operate and manage those tenants together, but most of us don't, right? So if you only have one tenant, you're probably not worried about how those licenses are assigned. But suppose I took that same sentence and I scratched out tenants and I wrote in business units. Now all of a sudden it probably gets more interesting. One of our large enterprise customers is a food company. And the way they're structured is they have a single tenant. But within that tenant, they have a bunch of basically independent business units. So they have so-and-so creamery, and they have so-and-so Western States, and so on. And these business units are managed independently. They have their own headquarters. They're located in different geographies, but they're all supposed to be managed in a single central unit. So all kinds of interesting questions that come up from that about, okay, so who's paying for these licenses? If I hire a new employee in the creamery division, where does her salary come from and who pays for her license? Who controls how that license is assigned? Who decides what license she gets? Okay, now those are organizational questions that their IT team doesn't really have a lot of input into. But once we were able to show them that they had some historic patterns of, if I say license abuse, it sounds bad. Once I was able to show them that in some of their tenants, they had people who were, or they had a pattern organizationally of buying too many licenses for some business units that then just sat idle, they were able to rejigger their licensing spend in a way that helped them save a significant amount of money. How much am I paying for my licenses right now? Now, boy, if you want to start a fight, the best way is to get on an airplane or the best way used to be, to get on an airplane, ask everybody what they paid for their seat. Because you'd have some people who paid, $3,000 for a coach seat to go from New York City to Los Angeles. You have other people who paid $200, right? And the universal truth about airfares is if you find out that somebody else paid less money than you did for the same seat, it's really irritating. Well, the same thing is true for Office 365 licenses. So maybe the fifth best way to start a fight is at an IT conference. Ask people how much they're paying per E3 or per E5 or per add-on. The reason why this is so different in different places is that Microsoft has so many different levers that they can pull to adjust the price. In some ways, it's similar to buying a car. My middle son has a Miata that he loves, but he's decided now that he has a house and a garden and some pets, he probably needs a truck instead. And he has never traded in a car before. So explaining to him all the different ways that a car dealer can move one number higher or lower by changing all the other numbers in that equation has been really educational for him. And the same thing is true with Microsoft. You might be paying, 11 euro per E3, and somebody else might be paying 14 euro. But it turns out when you look at the totality of your enterprise agreement with Microsoft, your total cost for those licenses is higher. Microsoft just disguised it by giving you some BIF funds for consulting or giving you some Azure credits or something else. So understanding what you actually pay for licenses and whether you are using what you pay for, really important. So let's talk about how you start to answer some of these questions, such as what licenses do I actually have? Microsoft, and I'm going to say this as gently as I can, Microsoft has a lot of work to do here. And they have done a lot. If you look at the screenshot of the portal that I've got on the right-hand side of this slide and compare it to what it looked like a year ago, much less 5 years ago, it's gotten a lot easier to see what licenses you have and how they're allocated. But it is still very difficult to do some basic tasks to answer the questions that I talked about on the earlier slide. If you want to see, for example, show me all the people in country X who have license Y, there is no way to do that from the portal directly. You can do it from PowerShell relatively easily. But the portal focuses on showing you what you have subscribed to and how many licenses there are. And if you download the license assignment data that you can get from the portal, then you see something like the CSV that I have shown here, where it tells you, okay, here's a SKU, here's how many licenses you have, but that's it. Okay, so there are some fairly rudimentary tools in the admin center, but Microsoft's real focus is on every other aspect of administration. I think that's probably the nicest way I can put it. They have not put a lot of effort into licensing and billing, other than making sure that they can bill you. The billing services in 365 and Azure really in many ways are the least advanced and least frequently updated components of the service. So if you think about what that means, right? So if you only get the data that Microsoft gives you, it's difficult for you to do some basic things that organizations often want to do. Now, of course, this list isn't going to cover everybody all the time, but internal billing is something that I very commonly get requests for from customers. So in the scenario I mentioned earlier with the food company, what they want is they want every month, they want the head of operations for the creamery to get a bill that says, okay, you have 4,217 users and you're consuming 4,924 E3 licenses, and that's going to cost you X dollars. Here's how you pay it. Okay. Other organizations may have different requirements, but the basic requirement of I want to see how much I am spending by business unit, by tenant, by country, by job function is really common, and Microsoft's tools just don't give you a good way to do that. Figuring out which job roles have which licenses assigned. So very common, especially at larger companies, to have resource allocation according to pay grade or job grade. So for example, if you are a junior something or other, then you get this kind of computer and you sit in a little desk in an open office. If you are a senior, whatever it is, you get a nicer computer and you maybe get a cubicle. And if you're a grand senior, whatever it is, then you get a nicer computer and you get an office with a door and so on. Well, the same thing is true for licenses, right? Very common where I talk to enterprise customers who say, okay, I want all of my salespeople to have the following license. Everybody in sales gets a CRM license. Okay, well, that seems pretty straightforward. Everybody in engineering gets a Visio license, and everybody who has a title of project manager or a custom extension attribute 14 value of PM01, they're a project manager, and so they get a subscription to project. Figuring out how to do that is not hard. Figuring out whether that is being done and monitoring it consistently and looking for exceptions and fixing those exceptions is harder than you might think. Just a general problem of figuring out how licenses are allocated across countries or territories or business units is a challenge. And then finally, the thing I was talking about earlier, if you want to know what percentage of license slack you have as a whole and what that's costing you, Microsoft tools don't give you a way to do that. They will show you how many E3, E5, Visio, Power BI, et cetera. They'll show you how many of those licenses you have bought, and they will show you how many are allocated on a tenant by tenant basis. But they don't give you an all up. They don't give you anything for costing. And then if you wanted to drill in and see, okay, well, it looks like I've got 75% license allocation total in my tenant. Where are the hot spots? So if I have 75%, that means I have 25% slack. Where is the slack concentrated? Is it uniform across every division? In other words, if I wanted to start tightening up the slack, where would I want to start first? So my recommendation, if these questions or issues look like things you would like to know more about, my recommendation is you need to start looking at third-party products. Now, coincidentally, I happen to make one that I'm pretty proud of called Nova. I'm going to show you very quickly a couple of example reports that help answer some of the questions that we've talked about here. So this one is showing all the subscriptions that are non-aggregated. In this case, just means the report is intentionally not trying to combine different types of E3 or different types of E5, because you've got, for example, E5 without audio conferencing, E3 with. But then when I start aggregating according to the SKU type or the creation date or the trial type, I can see very quickly, where do I have trials? Who has trial licenses? How many of them are there? What would it cost me if I wanted to convert those into real licenses? And so on. I also often want to see who has a particular set of licenses. So in this case, you can see, I don't have any Visio license Slack because I'm using all the licenses I have. I've got a simple pie chart in the lower left corner showing you, okay, what percentage of my users have got each of these license or these workload licenses assigned? And I can go through and say, okay, well, I've got 100 Power BI licenses. I only have 2 of them allocated right now. So what that tells me is I have 98% Slack. Now, in this particular case, in this tenant, that Slack percentage, that's alarmingly high. But because we're a Microsoft partner, they give us 100 Power BI licenses for free. So the spending impact of that is nil. But being able to look and go, okay, I have 100 of these. I'm only using 2 of them. If I were paying for those, you better believe I would be asking some very hard questions about why do I have 100 of these expensive things that I'm not using? Okay, that wraps up figuring out what licenses you have, but it leads us to a really interesting and sort of fraught discussion about what licenses you actually need. So if you ask Microsoft, they'll say you need all the licenses all the time, right? Everybody should have an E5 and advanced compliance and. Now, it's interesting when you look at the history of the way Microsoft has evolved licensing in the service. Originally, there was only an E3, and then there was an E3 and some add-ons that you could get. Then they introduced the E5, which was an E3 plus some add-ons that you could buy separately, plus some things that were only available as part of the E5. But over time, Microsoft has done 2 things. One is they occasionally will peel off something desirable from a higher level SKU and move it to a lower level SKU. So they'll take a feature that used to require E5 or that used to require Azure AD Premium P1 or P2, and they will move it down to a lower price tier. Okay. Most of the time when they do that, it's either because they feel competitive pressure or because they are trying to sweeten the pot to keep people on a mid-range SKU. But the other thing that they do, which they're really good at, is they put in new functionality that is only available in a higher end SKU. So for those of you who remember when Microsoft started introducing what we now call My Analytics and Workplace Analytics, those features were originally only available in the E5, right? Why? Well, Microsoft figured, okay, organizations that want these features can be incentivized to pay more money to get them. Well, they weren't wrong. As Microsoft rolls new features out, they follow a mix of these strategies, peeling premium features down or adding new super premium features on the top. So if you think about what that means for you, right, it means you don't really need to buy every license Microsoft sells as long as you understand what people actually need to do within your organization. So you probably already have a good understanding of who needs E3s, who needs E5s, who may have additional storage requirements, who needs things like international PSTN calling. If you know the job roles that your organization has to support, that'll give you a pretty good idea of which base and add-on licenses the different roles need. But I'm going to go out on a limb and say that even if you have a really good understanding of that, there are probably some things about your license estate that you don't know. This really boils down into two categories. One is who has more than they need. In other words, are you paying for licenses for people to give them capabilities that they are not using? Then the second is who has less than they need. This is a tricky question, okay, because there's an interplay between these two. For the people who have more license than they need, normally what this looks like is you have bought licenses for a job role and assigned those licenses to the job role, and if for whatever reason some workload in that license is not appropriate or doesn't get good uptake in the job role. Give you an example. I worked with a customer once that really wanted to deploy OneDrive everywhere. Their legal department just wouldn't use it. They were so used to the idea that the way you exchange documents in the world is you attach them to an email and send them to someone, that it was a real battle for this customer to get their legal department to embrace the idea that, hey, you know what? You don't have to email attachments around. You know what that came from? It came from their legal department having been entrenched in a tradition of using email-based compliance systems. And they knew that, okay, if I put an attachment into an email, it's going to be preserved. It'll be subject to discovery. It'll be, we have litigation hold turned on for everybody. So that's a good way to make sure that this document permanently is archived the way that it's supposed to be. So their reluctance to use OneDrive was motivated by a really good and important business purpose. It just seemed weird to the IT people. They were like, why wouldn't you use this? Okay, so sometimes there are good reasons for this, but understanding if you've got people who aren't using a workload, understanding why that is really key to getting them to start using it, which is one of the possible outcomes of examining who has more license capability than they need. Now, for who has fewer capabilities or workloads or licenses than they need, this is an interesting question too. Consider an organization that has a lot of people who are what I think of as physical plant workers. So my local school system has, I'll make this number up, they have probably 1,000 teachers and administrators. They have probably another 500 people who cut the grass and fix the air conditioning and drive the school buses. Those people are out and about, they're doing stuff. Do they need email? Well, this is a really interesting question. It goes to the core of everything that Microsoft is doing around the first line worker licensing packages that they're putting together. You can make a pretty good argument that everybody in the organization needs some way for you to communicate with them in writing, and that email is a logical way to do that. So you could certainly say, yeah, everybody in my school system needs an E3 or an Exchange Online P1 or something so that they have a mailbox that you can send mail to say things like, hey, there's a retirement ceremony for the superintendent next Friday at 3 o'clock, or we're making a change to the state pension plan implementation, or whatever it is, right? Uh, you can also make an argument that if those people don't need email or won't use email, then they wouldn't benefit from that workload. Why would you pay extra money for it? Okay, that's a fair point. But it's completely dependent on the business. It has nothing to do with what I think as the IT guy. It has to do with whether the people in that role and the people who manage the organization see the value of those services applied to that role. So this leads me to talking about the second principle of adopting what you buy. Now, email adoption is really not a thing. Okay, and I say that because it's sort of self-adopting. People are so accustomed to and dependent on reliable email that when you move a company to the cloud, as long as you don't, as long as their email system doesn't get screwed up as a result, everybody's going to use email post-migration, just like they did before. So people who had email before will keep using it. Maybe in the migration, you get email for some additional people that didn't have it beforehand. But despite the capacity and capability improvements that you would hope are going to take place when you move from on-prem to the cloud, at the end of the day, email is still just email, right? It might be better email, but it is what it is. So getting people to adopt cloud-based email in Office 365 is really pretty simple. That's not necessarily true for the other services in the portfolio. There are a bunch of different reasons why that's true. Because not everybody understands the value, not everybody understands the capability of some of these workloads. So I would wager that if you were to sit down with a randomly chosen group of people from your organization, you said, hey, can you tell me what Microsoft Planner is? Can you tell me what the Shifts application is for? What's Sway? You probably have a lot of people who would look at you funny. They wouldn't know the answer to those questions. And that's okay, right? I mean, if you think about it, Sway is a good example of a workload that you essentially get it for free. It comes as part of your E3 or E5. If people aren't using it, it doesn't cost you anything necessarily, but there is some additional value that you can maybe squeeze out of there. But the big area where you are going to win in applying these principles is very simple. If you have licensed Slack, that Slack represents money you are spending at every license purchase or license renewal. So go back to that 18% average Slack figure that I cited earlier and say, okay, for a 10,000 seat organization, 18% Slack is 1,800 licenses. At the standard Microsoft retail price for licenses, that's $432,000 per year for that 10,000 seat organization. Now, on the one hand, I know a lot of you are accustomed to having done this dance before with Microsoft and with other vendors who will quote what seems like a really high number and use that as justification to get you to do something. Okay, so I get it. Maybe you're thinking, well, I only have 2,000 users. Or, hey, my Slack percentage is only 7%. Or, well, I don't pay $20 per user per month. I pay less than that. Okay, I will grant all those things as being true, right? Almost nobody pays the full MSRP for licenses. And in a 10,000 seat organization, if you have 18% Slack, that's kind of a lot. But again, this is based on the data we actually gathered from actual live Quadratech customers. So I didn't make it up. It's not based on an industry analytics firm, averaging something. This is the real stuff. So let's say that you only have 1,000 seats at 18% Slack, which is probably more feasible in a lot of organizations. That's still $50,000 a year, right? Now, I want to be really transparent with you because sometimes at this point in the conversation, when I'm talking to an actual customer, they get really excited. You can see their eyes light up. They're like, wow, $432,000. I'm going to be the hero, right? On a 3-year renewal, that's a little over $1.2 million. I'm going to look really great when I go to my boss and tell him that we can save that money. Well, yes, but. Okay, the reason I say yes, but is, as you know, Microsoft loves to take your money, but they hate to give it back. So if you are in the middle of a license cycle, so let's say you have a 3-year enterprise agreement and you're 18, 20 months in, you know what, if you go to Microsoft and say, oops, I'm sorry, I bought too many licenses, they probably are not going to allow you to reduce your license count. Now, with that said, I have a very large enterprise customer that is doing exactly that right now. They have 150-ish thousand employees. They have done a lot of tenant consolidation, and so as a result of that, they are going through a true down with Microsoft. So I don't want to get your hopes up. Microsoft does not routinely do those, but if you have a good rapport with them and good enough negotiating skills, you may be able to make that happen. But let's say that you don't. Okay, so what I'm telling you now is if you are that 1,000 seat organization with 18% slack, going into your next renewal, you can arm yourself with some data to say, look, Microsoft, I have too many licenses. I'm paying you guys at least $50,000 a year too much. I want fewer licenses. Well, so what is Microsoft going to do, right? Think about it from their perspective. They really, really, really don't want to just say, okay, and take less money from you. So this is where they start turning knobs and say, well, I tell you what, if you keep the same number of licenses, we will give you 50K in Azure credits. If you keep the same number of licenses, we will send Satya over to wash your car. Right? All kinds of incentives they can offer that may not lower your direct licensing cost, but will give you some other things that are valuable to you. And knowing that and knowing ahead of time what your Slack percentage is and what that Slack percentage is costing you is extremely valuable when you come to those renewal negotiations. The other thing to keep in mind too, before I forget, is that a lot of time your licenses are not all in the same term. So if you don't have an enterprise agreement, what you may find is that you have a bunch of different subscriptions for the same SKU that start and finish at different times. So, hey, I'm going to open a new office in this country or a new office in this territory. So to do that, I'm hiring a bunch of people. So to do that, I'm going to buy another 500 licenses. Okay, cool. Now you have your main subscription that has, say, 2,000 licenses in it, and you've just bought another 500 licenses with a different subscription term. Okay, remember earlier I talked about aggregated versus non-aggregated in that report sample. This is an opportunity for you to say, oh, okay, well, now I have 18% slack. So even though the number of licenses I have in one subscription versus another may not look like there's much slack, what I can do is reassign those licenses across subscriptions and then not renew one of them. Okay, so if you have 18% slack in a 10,000 seat organization, you could maybe do away with that 500 seat organization, the 500 seat subscription altogether. Remember that your goal here is you want to get to the nirvana of optimized licensing, where you are buying only what you need and then adopting everything that you buy. So one very important step along that path is to figure out, okay, who is not using the license that they currently have? Number one cause or number one thing that I look for when I go into a customer and I'm trying to show them the value of having this data, right? Because I'm not going to lie, I show customers the value of having this data because it makes them say, wow, I can learn all that. I'm going to save a bunch of money. Yes, I would like to buy Nova. All right, let's be really transparent about it. Number one thing I look for is who has Pro Plus, or as we now call it, Microsoft 365 apps for enterprise, and isn't using it. Because the difference between E3 and a lower level SKU is primarily the right to install and run Office on the desktop. And if you have users who aren't using that, I can almost guarantee it's going to be cheaper for you to buy them Exchange Online plus SharePoint plus OneDrive plus Teams instead of paying the Pro Plus tax if they don't need the desktop applications. Okay, another case in point. Man, if I had a nickel for every time I went into a customer who had done something like convert their licensed users who left the company to shared mailboxes, but forgotten to remove the licenses and still had Pro Plus capable, or sorry, M365 apps capable licenses assigned to shared mailboxes when they didn't need to, or had disabled users who had left the organization but didn't remove licenses from them. There are a lot of potential places where you may have license slack that you didn't think about. And a tool such as Nova can expose that, make it really obvious where those Slack licenses are hiding. Who has zero or low activity with OneDrive, Teams, or some other core workload? Okay, maybe those people are candidates for a less expensive license that has fewer workloads in it. Who's not using their add-on licenses? This is a killer, right? I'll give you an example from Quadratech. We've got people in 8 countries now, and Microsoft does not have calling available in every one of those countries. For example, my people in Slovakia and in Switzerland cannot have a Teams license, or sorry, a Teams calling PSTN license assigned to them because those licenses are not available in those geographies. So that's easy, right? Though they just don't get those licenses. But it turns out many of those people had Skype calling licenses assigned to them because those were available. And when we got digging into the data and saw, look at this, I can stop paying for these licenses because the people who have them aren't making any phone calls. Okay, that saved us some money. So once you have a good understanding of who's not using the licenses they currently have, okay, that's step one. Once you understand that, then you get to make a decision. This is a fork in the road. One path that you can take is you can downgrade the license of someone who's not using it. So I bought you a Power BI license, you're not using it, I'm going to take it away. Okay. Now where this gets tricky is when you think about things like data retention for email and OneDrive. Okay. This is the same problem people have when they have leavers in the organization. If you just remove their account or remove their license, then their data is eventually going to expire and go away. That might be okay, it might not be okay. It's going to depend on the data, it's going to depend on your retention requirements and so on. So you can't just blindly put out a policy that says, oh, okay, well, if anybody's not using the license, then I'm just going to yank it and they will get downgraded. But there probably is some percentage of your Slack that comes from people who you can safely downgrade without losing anything important. The other thing that you can do is you can start using adoption and change management techniques to get people to use more of what you have already paid for. Okay, those of you who have had kids of any age are really familiar with the idea or the problem of you buy something for your kid and they want nothing to do with it. Okay, now sometimes this is no big deal. If it's a $5 toy, okay, that's not a problem. If it's something else that's more expensive, it may be more of a problem. And so you have to decide, okay, am I going to deallocate that resource? Okay, well, I bought you this fancy computer and all you ever do with it is play Minecraft. You don't use it for anything useful, so I'm going to take it away and give it to your sister. That's the first example. The other is, okay, I bought you this fancy computer because you said you wanted to learn how to edit videos. Let's you and I sit down and start learning how together so that you get some value and you start adopting this thing. You might think that's a semi-autobiographical example, and you might be right. Anyway, the idea behind driving adoption, not to turn this into an adoption webinar, but the basic idea behind it is you need to understand the behavior of your users and use that as a springboard to figure out why are they not doing what you want them to do. Okay, so for that to work, you need to be able to implement campaigns that help you understand the actual usage data that you see for the workloads. In other words, what do people actually do? How many messages do they send? How many meetings do they go to? How many files do they share, et cetera? You need to be able to specify what metrics mean active or adopted for you. The reason I say this is Microsoft has got their own set of metrics that they use when they're talking to partners about Teams adoption. And the truth of the matter is, you really do have to figure out, okay, in my environment, I would consider someone active if they did X, Y, Z. And in this other environment, I would consider a user active if they did PDQ. And then once you have those data items in place, you can start gathering baselines that tell you, okay, before I do anything, before I start trying to get people to adopt this technology, what does their basic usage look like? How often are they sending messages? How often are they initiating Teams calls? How often are they participating in Teams meetings? With that baseline data, then you can start to build campaigns that guide people to do what you want them to do. Now remember that adoption is a combination of things. You have to understand what people are doing. You have to know what you want them to do. You have to give them the tools so that they can do it, which includes training. Then you have to make them want to do it. And if you miss any of those elements, your adoption process is not going to be successful. If you just have some idea that you want everybody to use Teams, but you don't know who's using Teams, you don't know how much they're using it, you can't tell, then you don't really have an adoption campaign. You have a plan to shout at people until they do what you want. Okay, and that's never going to be successful. So a good set of adoption tools will help you understand what good looks like. In other words, how will I know if this plan is succeeding? And that'll be based on a good understanding of what people are doing, when they're doing it, what they're doing with it. So I'm going to show you a couple of sample adoption reports from the Adoption Accelerator functionality that's in Nova, and then we can have some Q&A. This shows the specific metrics that we gather for teams. So I can see, okay, where are my biggest teams? What are people doing in teams? Well, very predictably, you see we've got peaks and valleys according to the day of the week, which is exactly what you would expect. If I showed you live customer data, what you would see now is starting maybe March 15th, 16th, 17th, just this huge explosion in the volume of Teams chat and Teams calls. You can probably figure out why that is. Okay, with that, Brad, let's take some Q&A.
And questions we do have here. Let me get started. Okay, the first question that comes in, Paul, is when you were talking about Slack, is there a percentage or a target that you typically look for in an organization?
So that's a tricky question, right? It gets up there with how long is a piece of string. I want to see it in the single digits, generally with the understanding that you have to have some slack to cover sudden organizational changes. So you have a merger or acquisition, you have a business expansion, you have some other thing that means you need to have a few extra licenses in your pocket so that you don't have to go out and buy a brand new subscription when you need more licenses. On the other hand, if it's more than 7, 8, 9%, what that tells me is you probably have overbought and there are some savings that are waiting to be squeezed out of that slack percentage.
The next question is, it says, for an academic license, if the student completes the school and is leaving, can the student continue to benefit from the license, or should the school admin revoke it?
That is a really good question that I am completely unqualified to answer. I can tell you, I have not sold Nova to a lot of academic institutions, and the reason is Microsoft sells the A-series licenses for faculty and staff. They are so inexpensive, and the student licenses are free that
Oh, did you just cut out there, Paul?
Okay, Brad, did you lose my audio there by any
Yeah,
chance?
just a brief second.
Okay, so my headset is paired both to my cell phone and my computer, and Siri decided to wake up for some reason. So
Nice.
there's your unwanted AI interruption. So, for the academic organizations we've talked to, what typically happens is they are able to, as long as a student has some affiliation with the university, then it's okay for them to keep the license active. And that's what most of them do because they're not paying for the student licenses. The exact terms of that are going to be between your academic institution and Microsoft. So I don't want to give a blanket statement that that's okay, but I certainly see that happen. And I can tell you, I have an Office 365 license through Georgia Tech, my alma mater, because I applied for graduate school. Hadn't taken any graduate courses, but I applied, and that was enough to get them to give me a mailbox that I've had for 3 years and counting now. And I'm pretty sure they're not paying for it. So that's at least one data point.
The next question is, do you have any tips for negotiating with Microsoft when it comes to licensing and updating your contract?
So yes, I do. I'm going to think of the famous bank robbers adage that you get more with a smile and a gun than you do with just a gun. Think about the fact that when you're talking to Microsoft, right, your point of leverage is you have money and they would like to have it. And I know that sounds really silly, but it's true, right? All of the people you negotiate with or deal with at Microsoft as part of that chain are all incented to get you to buy something. And if you don't buy it, then that's going to harm their numbers and their compensation. but they also have leverage on you. I mean, what are you going to do if you don't buy Office 365? What are you realistically going to do? Are you going to move your workloads back on prem? You're going to quit using email and put everybody on Zoom and the consumer Gmail? No, probably not. So this is, it's important to recognize that. It's important to recognize Microsoft has got so many different elements that they can bring into the negotiation that, number one, they may not be able to give you what you ask for in terms of reduction in cost or increase in license count for Office, but they can probably make up for that in a different way. Now, the downside of that flexibility is that they also can make you think you're getting a better deal. In the same way that when you go trade in a car, they say, oh yeah, we'll give you $10,000 for your trade-in. That's not worth that, because what they've done is they've tacked an additional amount onto the back end of your loan. So the biggest tips I have would be to say, realize that there can be other factors that Microsoft can put in to sweeten the pot, but also realize that they can use those factors to increase what your walk away bottom line cost is. So just keep a very sharp eye on what kind of trade-offs they're offering you.
The next question is, why doesn't Microsoft make it easy to view the licenses that are used and not used?
So there are sort of two potential explanations for that. One is the conspiracy theory that they don't want you to know what you're paying for licenses because everybody would be horrified and they would quit buying Office 365. Okay, and I don't actually believe that's true. Microsoft very much is, they can do anything, but they cannot do everything. Even Microsoft does not have enough resources to improve every part of the service simultaneously as much as we might want them to. And honestly, I just think billing and licensing management has not gotten that much attention because it works well enough. Now, if thousands of customer tenants were coming back to Microsoft and saying, you know what, license management, man, it's just too hard. It's much easier when we use Google and we're going to go to Google Apps. Well, you better believe Microsoft would fix it. As proof for that explanation, I'm just going to say, look at how much attention Microsoft has put into fixing stuff where Zoom makes Teams look bad. And imagine if somebody had a Office suite that had better licensing or better license management than Microsoft did. Imagine how suddenly they would move competitively to try to make their solution better. There isn't one, and so they haven't had to, so they don't.
And the next question here might be the last one as we start to run out of time. It says, my organization is on a monthly subscription. Subscription, meaning we can add and reduce licenses monthly. Is there a better way to save some cost before looking into reducing the licensing using this method you just shared?
So if you're on monthly licensing, my guess is probably that you have bought those licenses through the portal, right? And so when you sign up for a subscription, Microsoft will sell you that license as an annual commitment, but you can pay for it monthly or you can pay for it annually. And so if you've got a monthly subscription, or sorry, if you have an annual subscription that is billed monthly, then every month you pay for however many licenses you have. The problem with doing that is because you're just buying it through the portal, you have no negotiating leverage at all because there's no human involved, right? It is exactly like buying a game on Xbox Live or something where the price you see on screen is the price you pay. What I would suggest to you, if you're interested in trying to save those costs, is start figuring out what it would take for you to buy those licenses in the future through a reseller or directly from Microsoft. Now, how you do that means there are a lot of variables depending on how big your organization is, what vertical you're in, what country you're in, and so on. So I can't give you a one-size-fits-all answer. But the minute you move away from buying stuff through the portal, which is a one-size-fits-all, to talking to a human who wants to sell you something, you're going to find you have a lot more leverage and a lot more negotiating opportunity than you've got right now.
Good advice, Paul. If people have additional questions, what's the best thing we should do, or how do they reach out, or what's your advice there?
So we have a couple of things that I wanted to close with. One is we have a white paper about closing the license management gap that I would encourage everybody on the on the webcast to go grab from our website. I'm biased since I contributed quite a bit to it, but it's a good practical explanation that goes a little deeper into some of the things I've talked about today than we had time for. The second thing is, as I mentioned, I'm the product manager for Nova. Nova is an integrated platform that does license reporting, license assignment, policy management. So you can do things like say, find me all the people who are not using this particular workload and put them in a group and then remove this license. Or anytime I add a new user who is a salesperson in the United States, they automatically get this license. The more you can automate license provisioning, the less likely it is that you will end up with a lot of slack, because slack comes from people doing stuff ad hoc in part. So go to quadratech-it.com/Nova and have a look there, and I think you'll find some goodies. But with that said, Brad, I'm afraid I think we're out of time. So thank you for hosting.
Yeah, this was you could not have timed this up any better, Paul. I'm going to assume that that was intentional. But there is one last question which I am able to answer. People are wondering if the slides and the video are going to be available for replay, and absolutely. Give me a couple days, but it'll be up on petri.com/webinars is where you'll be able to find that information. But Paul, we very much appreciate you taking time out of your busy day talking licensing. Thanks to everybody for sticking around. We had the attendance stayed pretty high throughout the entire webinar, Paul, which means that even though your cat typed on the keyboard, we're not going to hold it against you. Thanks, everyone, and we'll catch all of you right back here next time.
Yep, thanks, everybody.